In terms of winning the game, there are three ways to do so. One way is to research the atomic bomb. Researching the atomic bomb means you can achieve this technology, the Atomic Research 1, and then Atomic Research 2, which you have to do in order, and you have to keep order of it in your secret vault. This is your responsibility. And you can only achieve one technology level per year when talking atomic research. So in 1936, for example, under the normal rules for achieving technologies, you can either play 2 Atomic Research 1 cards face up, or even better, face down, in order to surprise your opponents later. And then in subsequent years, you can research Atomic Research 2 and Atomic Research 3 and then Atomic Research 4. These are the 4 levels. Of course, you have to discard 2 cards of the same technology, or use some wild cards that are valid for your Atomic Research level, or even use industrial espionage to pair it with an enemy's atomic technology level if they have revealed it. And at the moment you reveal your achieved Atomic Research 4 technology, plus you have an Air Force unit that can legally reach the enemy's main capital, you win the game. So it is the summer of 1944. The Germans have control of Riga and the Baltic states, and they've got an air force here, which is in undisputed friendly land area, and with its movement allowance of 2, it can reach Moscow. They play a summer card of any value, and when it is the turn of T, their turn, they reveal their Atomic Research 1, 2, 3, and 4 levels technologies, and they declare that they have this Air Force unit in Riga. It can legally reach Moscow and drop an atomic bomb there, so they instantly win the game. This is the atomic victory. The second victory condition is to control 2 enemy capitals at the same time. This is called military victory. So for example, if the Germans have managed to control Leningrad and Moscow at the end of a movement phase, if it was empty, or at the end of the combat phase, if they have managed to defeat their enemies there. Actually, control is evaluated at the start of its phase. The rule is that you apply control at the beginning of its phase. So normally when you finish the combat phase and when starting the supply phase, before you do anything regarding supply, you evaluate control, and if the Germans have managed to gain control over both these areas, for example, or even Leningrad and London, for example, they instantly win the game. And for this win condition, it doesn't matter if you have lost control of one of your own capitals. You just have to control 2 enemy capitals or sub-capitals at the same time.
Different enemies?
No, it has to be the same enemy, like in the case of Leningrad and Moscow.
Okay.
This is sufficient to secure the military victory.
Okay.
And the third victory condition would be economic victory, which means at the beginning of a new year, you declare you have accumulated 25 victory points or more. Now, victory points are your production level, which you adjust according to which enemies you conquer diplomatically or militarily, or even you might lose some production if some other players gain control of your own territory. So when your production level reaches a sufficient level, say 20, you add this to your peace dividend values, the ones you have drawn in its new year phase after you were at peace and have not violated the neutral in the last year. You also subtract 1 point for every declaration of war you have made upon the opponents. Also, you gain 2 victory points if you control an enemy capital or sub-capital. The rule is 2 points per enemy capital or sub-capital, but of course if you control 2 capitals or sub-capitals, you are already the winner, so we're not going to go through that. And lastly, 1 point for each level of atomic research you have achieved. So if you have reached this far, you've got 2 more victory points, for example. So once more, 25 victory points means economic victory during the New Year's victory check. And lastly, if we finish 1945 without a winner, then we've got hegemony victory, kind of European hegemony victory, which means the player with most victory points wins the game at the end of 1945, as if we are conducting a 1946 production. However, for this last case, we do not count blockade. I mean, we take into account all of our resources, even the blockaded ones, which we're going to talk about during the blockade section. But for the sake of hegemony victory check, we count all of our resources and not only the unblocked ones. Same for population. USA is a special case. Its diplomacy can be affected normally by these USA action cards, and of course at the end of the government phase, for each influence card you have played, you place 1 influence marker. The difference is that even though the German or Soviet players can place influence normally, they cannot gain USA as their satellite. USA may only join the Western players' side if they accumulate 3 influence markers here, in which case we flip this marker here from USA neutral into West satellite, with the already mentioned effects of dropping their industry cost and also some other effects. For example, from now on, Washington, this capital, can be counted as a supply source. Rather, when you gain the first influence marker as the Western player, you gain these population and the resource values, which in this case would be 4 resources and 2 population. So when you gain 3 influence markers, and this one is flipped upside down, then the US joins the West's side, and these forts are deployed here, a 4-pip fort in Washington and a 2-pip fort in New York. And from now on, you may also build units under the normal production rules. You can build the cages or upgrade some already built cages. And however, you cannot move them outside USA if you are not at war with some player. But since the moment the West is at war, you can move the American units normally, and they can participate at the ongoing war. So, for example, if the German players conquer Paris by attacking the West, the American units could then be redeployed by a strategic movement to London and then attack Paris in kind of a historical recreation of D-Day. One other difference is that during 1941, 1942, 1943 and 1944, this is the so-called USA public opinion phase, which means in New Year you gain 1 free influence point in America, which might convert America into West satellite. Now, if USA is a West satellite in 1942, you get 1 unit of its primary type, which means 1 infantry unit, 1 tank unit, 1 fleet, and 1 Air Force unit. So you would place these units at 1 combat value in undisputed friendly USA home territory. And if you have not managed to make USA a satellite of yours by then, these units are forfeited. You don't get them. And in 1943, you gain again these units but each of them has got a value of 2. So in addition to the units already joining the war, you get these units as well. And in 1944, you again get them, new ones, at 3 combat value each. So they can be used to turn the game for the Allies at its later stages. You only have to have made USA your ally by 1942 or 43 or 44 if you want to get these units. And the last rule regarding USA is that if the Axis player violates USA, which means they attack USA territory, the Soviet player cannot do so, or if enemy units enter Canada, which can be done by both the Soviets and the Axis player, then the 1 combat value units join the game immediately, and even if the area is disputed, you can deploy those. And in the next year's production, you get the 2 combat value ones, and in the year after the next, you get the 3 combat value ones. This all happens when America is violated, which means either the Axis player attacks USA or Soviet or Axis units enter Canada. Now, let's move on to the other major powers, because as we have mentioned, Britain, USSR and Germany are great powers, and these 3, USA, France and Italy, are major powers. There are some other rules regarding these ones, which means, namely, if Paris falls or if Rome falls, French units or Italian units already on the map are immediately removed from the game into the box, never to return to the game. So if, for example, the German players gain control of Paris, all these French units, wherever they are on the map, are removed from the game. In this case, after conquering the capital of a major power, the conquering faction places its own marker to indicate that the Germans have, for example, taken control over Paris, which means just like with colonies, they now have control over all the unoccupied areas of France. And if later another faction gains control of Paris, they place their own flag and get control of it as well. And also there is some special treatment for their colonies. In some way these colonies now revolt against the French, and if there is no other power occupying their capital, then Algiers, for example, revolts, and you place a fort equal to the capital's master value, and this also happens to Syria. You deploy a single combat value fort there, and from that point onwards they are treated as neutrals, like normal, like you have to violate them in order to conquer them, and if you violate them the other players get reaction cards equal to the capital's master value, unless some player was controlling this area before Paris falls. Same happens with Rome. When it falls, Libya revolts. So a question frequently asked online is the following: what happens if some faction conquers a major power's sub-capital, for example Paris, and their colony revolts? So we place this double fort here, and another faction is occupying another area of said neutral. In this case the answer might be really simple. There are no effects for this guy, the British one occupying Tunisia, but in case you move into another land area of the neutral, you are committing a violation of neutrality and you suffer the normal consequences. So, moving into combat. After each player conducts his movement phase, which means you possibly have moved some units into enemy territory or neutral territory after having declared or violations of neutrality and declarations of war possibly. You trigger as many battles as you wish and have to trigger all battles in which you conducted aggression. So when we say battle, we mean units of enemy factions coexisting in the same area. So here we've got a battle, and here we've also got a battle. And the active player has to reveal all his units before triggering any battle. So the other players know which units you have moved in. And then, if you have conducted an aggression this turn, which means you have right now moved your units into an area occupied by enemy units, solely occupied by enemy units, then you have to trigger this battle. But if you have just brought some reinforcements, then you are free to avoid triggering the aggression. So if your unit had survived the previous battle here in the previous season, and you just brought this unit here, of course you reveal it, and then you may avoid triggering this battle here because you have not committed an aggression right now. Again, you are the attacker if you trigger this combat because you are the active player and the other player is the defender, and you are still the aggressor in this area because you are trying to conquer it. The control belongs to the Soviets, which are the owners, but you have not made the aggression this turn, so you can avoid triggering the combat if you see that chances are not in your favor. So when triggering the combat, it's a pretty simple procedure compared to what we have talked about this far. We just have to consult this chart again. So following this sequence, units are firing or taking their combat action in the following order. First fortresses, then air forces, carriers, and so on. But when we have units of the same type belonging to multiple factions, it is the defenders unit taking their combat action first. So, for example, if in this battle we have a fortress and a tank for the Soviets and a German tank, and of course I'm not referring to this sea area, I'm referring to a land area battle, then the Soviet fortress would fire first because it is above, and then when we move down to the tanks, the Soviet player, if it is the defender, would fire first, and then it would be the turn of the Axis player. Now, I said fired, but this is not entirely correct because when you take your combat action, you can either fire or retreat. Each unit individually, when it is its turn for its combat action, can either fire or retreat. Retreating means kind of like disengaging into some other friendly, unoccupied, undisputed area. So, for example, if the Germans are controlling Algiers, during the combat they can retreat this unit to Algiers. And again, they have to respect the border limits. So, for example, if they have 2 ground units and 1 fleet, of course, ANS units ignore border limits. They can even land move here and retreat. But ground units have to respect the ground borders, so only one of these guys can cross this border in order to retreat to Algiers. You can retreat into adjacent open seas if you are an ANS unit, and of course if you are an aeroplane, you have to retreat into a friendly land area again for purposes of refuel. You cannot retreat into an adjacent open sea. However, if you are a ground unit, you have to retreat either into a friendly land area that is adjacent, or you can retreat into an adjacent open sea only if you've got units there to escort you. I mean friendly units in this sea. If this open sea is empty, this ground unit cannot retreat here. Now, if you remember when talking about disengaging during your movement phase, I mentioned that you can disengage into open seas and then continue your movement unless you are re-engaging an enemy. You can otherwise retreat into the adjacent open seas and continue, but this is a big difference in retreat because during combat you cannot retreat into the adjacent open seas unless you've got your own units to escort you. Now imagine yourselves, to make it easier, that retreat during combat is a procedure made in a hasty manner, so you have to be prepared for that and have some ships, for example, to escort you out and take you away. But if you are disengaging, this is done in an organized manner, and you can of course disengage using your boats possibly, and then continue towards which area you want to go. So each unit during its turn can either fire or retreat, and the units of the same type may choose different actions. One unit might retreat and the other one might fire. There is no restriction regarding that. And when firing, we have to consult this chart again, which clarifies the die roll ranges. So we roll one die for each unit's combat value or pips. So for example, if this is a 4 pip or 4 combat value German infantry, it would roll 4 dice. Now you also have to clarify which unit class you are attacking. So whichever kind of unit it is, it has to declare whether it is firing air or naval or ground or submarines. These are the 4 options, and you will notice that not all units can fire anywhere. For example, the submarines cannot attack the air forces. The die roll is 0, so it means that you cannot attack air forces at all. And if you are attacking a valid enemy unit class, then this is your die roll required for a hit. So, for example, air forces attacking air forces deal a hit for each 1 to 3 die rolls. So, for example, if your air force rolls 4 dice, and these are the dice rolls, you only deal 1 hit to the enemy air forces, so the opponent has to lose 1 of his air forces. Each unit has to select one enemy unit class and fire upon it. You cannot split your dice among different unit classes. However, if you have multiple units, like 2 different infantry blocks, one infantry can attack the air forces and one infantry can attack the ground forces, for example, whichever suits you best. So you roll the dice, you consult the die roll ranges, and if the die roll is in the die roll range, which means 2 or lower in this case or 3 or lower in this case, you deal a hit, and the opponent player has to allocate this hit. Each hit individually has to be allocated in the highest combat value unit possible. So for example, if the Soviets have a 2 combat value fort and a 1 combat value tank, and the German infantry is rolling 4 dice for its 4 combat value, and 2 of these rolls are hits because of the 3 and the 2, then the Soviet player has to apply the first hit onto the fort, which is the highest combat value one, and then the second hit can be applied to either his fort or his tank. And of course, if it loses its last combat value, it is removed from the game and can be recreated later during production. Before moving on, I would like to clarify that upon any moment, any player can disband any of its units. So for example, if you strike a deal with the rival player, and there's a lot of diplomacy in this game, you can disband your fort before combat so that he wins the combat for free, for example. Disbanded units go to your unit supply and can be rebuilt later. Same thing can be done with influence markers, and it's the so-called repudiation, but not if a country is locked diplomatically. I mean, if you have one influence marker in Algiers, you can remove it to possibly allow the other player to do something like violating this neutral, and it's a matter of negotiation. Now, back into combat. Each unit selects its combat action, either firing or retreating, rolls its dice, and then the hits are allocated. And when talking about land combat, this only happens once. Each unit only fires once, and then the combat round is concluded, and whichever units survived stay as they were. And the area is disputed if more than one faction's units are there, and the owner's units, the ones who were there first, are returned upright, for example, and the other ones are the aggressor's units. But when talking about a sea battle, here things are slightly different because the sea battle has to be fought to a conclusion. So for example, you will fight as many combat rounds as needed until only one side remains in this sea area. For this purpose, ground units at sea are considered convoys, and as you will notice, convoys cannot attack and actually have no combat action. So you cannot fire or retreat with convoys. And another restriction is that you cannot engage or disengage. So, for example, this is a very unlikely situation to occur with convoys from both sides being at the same area, because as a convoy you cannot engage the enemy unit or disengage from an enemy unit. And when in combat, you cannot do anything. If there is an enemy fleet, it will just sink you. So it's actually the ANS doing all the action here, which means air forces, navals, fleets, carriers, and submarines. And they all fire their combat rounds or retreat, and then we fight another round. However, air forces have to rebase after their combat round. So let's talk about rebase a bit. Whether it is a naval combat or a land combat, ANS units, instead of retreating, can rebase. So retreating in this case would be for this carrier to go into an adjacent friendly land area. But it could also rebase, which means it can move like it would normally move and reach a friendly land area, an undisputed one, in range. So for example, it could move 2 or 3 spaces in order to reach a friendly land area. This rebase should follow the normal movement restrictions, so you cannot move through disputed areas, for example. If you were a submarine, however, you could move through this area and end up in Rome, but a fleet cannot rebase to Rome through here, but it can rebase to Milan, for example, which is adjacent. So again, for people asking, and this has of course been asked on BGG multiple times, and it's hilarious to say the very least, there can be some cases where convoys are left alone in one area. For example, when you first declare war upon each other and you don't know which unit is which, some convoys may be left here, and there has been an argument that this is an illegal move because convoys cannot engage, but I strongly disagree to that. Of course, you can declare war, and in this case it would not be engaging, it just happens so that they are at the same area. And if you don't disengage, which would possibly be a bad idea to do anyway, because these are really useless at sea and you are at risk of losing them all, then you either fight a battle if there is a fleet, but there is also the case, of course, that an aeroplane strikes at you and then has to leave, and then you are left alone. And in this case, let's suppose that this area is not open seas for either player until somebody moves in and kills the enemy's convoys. So for these purposes, they may temporarily coexist. So some other things that I would like to mention regarding combat is that convoys are considered a separate class of units. So in this case, you have to target them separately. You either attack air forces or fleets, for example, or convoys, and you use your normal die roll ranges for the naval units. So for example, this Soviet air force unit could use its 3 combat value to attack air units 3 times, or 3 dice to attack fleets 3 times, I mean naval units, which could be either fleets or carriers, or it could attack submarines, or it could attack convoys. And if it attacks convoys, then for each one that it deals, it is a hit onto the convoys, and the highest value convoy has to absorb the hit, with a minor detail that it takes double damage. Convoys and carriers, when being hit, they receive double damage, so one hit would result in this. This 4 combat value would turn into 2. And the last thing that I would like to mention is that submarines have the ability to escape after surviving one combat round. So, for example, if nobody fires on the submarines, or if they survive the hits upon them, after the first round of sea combat, they can escape downwards, and in this case, you flip this unit face down, retaining its combat value, and it will not be participating for the rest of the naval battle for as long as this naval battle goes on. And later on, in some subsequent phase, you can move it out, or you can start a fight again as if it was present there normally. However, it serves a special purpose while being escaped, which is for blockades, and which we are going to talk about shortly.
So, can when a convoy is damaged, it's still double damage, but can that damage be split into two different convoys?
No, it cannot. So, in this case, if you have 3 convoys and one of them is at 2 combat value, if it is dealt a hit by a die roll of 1, for example, by this Air Force, then you have to allocate the hit fully onto this unit, and this will leave the game. You cannot deal 1 hit here and allocate the other one onto the tank. And lastly, I would also like to mention the carrier's special ability, which is shoot and scoot, or carrier strike, or hit and run if you prefer, which means instead of firing at enemy naval units, they can fire and retreat, but then instead of using their normal 2 die roll, they hit only at 1. So you fire as many dice as is your combat value, for example, and for each one you deal damage to the enemy fleets or carriers, and then you retreat before the enemy gets a chance to fire back at you, and you either retreat onto an adjacent friendly land area, like normally retreating, or rebase by conducting your normal movement until reaching a friendly land area in range. So, if there is no valid retreat or rebase route, then the unit is eliminated. So, for example, Germans here, if they do not control Algeria or Gibraltar or Spain, and if they cannot move into Sardinia or through Tyrrhenian Sea, they would all be eliminated. All but this one submarine, which can either escape at the end of a combat round or escape. However, in this case, they would move here, but of course, if this area is controlled by some other player or disputed, for example, then they would not be able to use this area either. And I would like to mention the rebase restriction and the retreat restrictions. So, when retreating, defenders' units cannot retreat the way the attackers came from. So, for example, in this case, the German player is engaging from Algiers onto Tunisia. In this case, the Soviet unit cannot retreat back to Algiers. It has to retreat onto Sfax, or onto Malta if you've got control of it, or into Tyrrhenian Sea if you've got a unit to escort you. But you cannot retreat the way the attacker came. And the opposite is also true, that the attacker's unit, if it retreats, it has to retreat the way it came and not retreat into other areas. And when talking about rebasing, which I repeat can only be done by ANS units, again it has to follow the normal retreat rules when retreating by rebasing, which means if during their combat round they choose to retreat and retreat by rebasing, they first have to retreat the way they came from if they are the attacker's unit. So if they came through here or through here, they have to first retreat here and then continue their rebase movement until reaching a valid rebase destination. This is the rebase during combat, which must follow the retreat restrictions. However,
what's the total move value they have during this move?
During this move, they retain their base movement allowance, which for an Air Force it would be 2. I mean, this is not considered strategic movement because you are practically disengaging, so you move at a normal movement allowance of 2. So you either choose to retreat into an adjacent area, a land area 1 or a sea area 1 if you can. Or you rebase using your normal movement allowance, which would be 2 or 3 for fleets or carriers, for example, and until reaching a land area. You cannot combine these two types of retreat. And at the end of combat, be it land combat or naval combat, the active players' ANS units may optionally rebase, which means I might have attacked with these units here, moved them in, and then after concluding the combat, I can rebase into possibly a friendly land area in range, an undisputed one, and in this case, I following the normal movement restriction, but not the retreat restrictions, which means I can rebase elsewhere, because this is an optional rebase, so it's treated like a move. I can rebase here, so I might just have attacked here and then moved these units here in order to save commands and move them even further than I normally would be able to. So control might change as a result of a battle. For example, if now the Soviet unit is destroyed or retreats into a friendly area, then you gain control of this territory. But only if you have a ground unit. This cannot be done by ANS unit. I mean, if you have only brought ANS units without ground support, then you are not gaining control no matter the result. Even if you eliminated the enemy, you have to retreat or rebase. So when solely attacking with ANS units, this is called a raid, and raids have to be resolved first. Before resolving any other battles, you have to resolve the raids and retreat or rebase your units wherever you want. Also, retreats cannot take place in areas that held battles, but raids are an exception in areas in which there were raids. So once more, when you attack an enemy area only with ANS units without ground support, this is a raid. You have to retreat your units no matter what, even if you destroyed the enemy totally. You are not gaining control if you don't have ground units. And if for some reason, possibly due to casualties, your ground units died and your ANS units are left without ground support in a disputed area like this one, then they have to leave because they have no ground support and there is an enemy unit. If there are units of both types, the aggressor's units have to comply first. Thus, they are the ones that have to leave this area. However, as we have mentioned, once you establish control, in later seasons you can just leave your ANS units there. One more restriction regards battle groups, which means when you are starting a sea battle, you may have engaged from a single area with your units or from multiple areas. So in this case, you arrange your units separately to show that this one came from Milan, and this one possibly came from Algiers, and this one came from Tunisia. So when the battle starts and players have to reveal their units, you can only choose and reveal one battle group. So in this case, you choose to reveal this one, and it will fight a full combat round against whichever units the Soviet player has. And then, if we have to conduct a second round, you can then reveal the next battle group to join the battle. And if there is a third combat round in this naval battle, you can reveal this battle group unit. But this is important because you might have to engage from different areas in order to prevent retreats. So, for example, you might want to engage here and here and here in order to possibly prevent retreats into friendly controlled areas. But in this case, the disadvantage is that you will have to reveal your battle groups one by one during its round. If you want to actually surround your opponent, attack him from all sides for a three-pronged attack and increase your chances of him not escaping.
So each battle group needs to come from a different area?
No, it does not regard the area they are coming from exactly. It's about units that started and ended their movement together. I mean, if these two are moving from here by this route, then this is a battle group. But if for some reason they follow the different route, then they are split as battle groups. It's whether they follow the same route. Okay. And one more thing is that when a faction declares war upon each other, for this season only, for the subsequent combat phase, in all combats that they trigger, in all battles that they trigger, they get first fire, which means if they got units of the same class as their opponent, they fire before them. So, for example, in this case, if the German player moves in and attacks the Soviet player, normally it would be the defender that would fire first with his air forces. But because in this season the German player declared war, he will have a surprise for this combat phase only, and his air forces will fire before the Soviet air units. And otherwise the combat sequence will remain as it was among the different classes of units. And of course you've got to take into account the various technologies that might give first fire to some units. Technologies are very important, and they can also modify your movement, like make your air forces move by 3 instead of the usual 2. And with this technology, infantry moves 3 times, 3 spaces instead of 2. And technologies like this one give you first fire, which means from now on, when you reveal this technology, your air forces will always fire before the enemy's units, regardless of which one is the defender and which one is the attacker. And if the enemy player also achieves this technology, then it cancels yours, and then we are back to the default sequence of the defenders' units of the same type firing first before the attackers once.
So how does this technology work, precision bomb sight?
Yes, okay, so the question is about precision bomb sight. Its text reads, AFs can bomb industry at IE1. So in this case, notice that this is different from normal raids. Normally, you can't raid unoccupied territory, which means you can't move your air forces and ships into an enemy area which is unoccupied by the enemy, just because you want to take control, which you of course can't do with AMS units. But this is an exception. Even if the enemy's capital is unoccupied, you can raid it just for this purpose. This means you can attack the enemy's capital whether it is unoccupied or not with your air forces, and I mean the main capital, be it London, Moscow or Berlin, and you make a special kind of die roll. You roll your dice and you have to roll once targeting industry, not ground, not naval, not air, not sub. You target industry at an I die roll range of 1. So for each of your dice rolls that is an 1, you reduce the opponent's industry by 1. So let's talk about this last phase which we have omitted, and this is blockade. It happens after the summer phase, and it works similarly to supply, and in this blockade phase, each of your controlled population and the resources have to trace a valid supply route or trade route to your main capital in order for this to be counted for your next production. So, supply happens at the end of each season for units, ground units that may possibly be suffering attrition, and the blockade happens after summer for your population and resources. So, for example, the Western player here has to prove to the enemies when at war that this population and these resource values can reach London. He can transport this population and these resources from India to London. Otherwise, they are blockaded. And I have to clarify that supply phases and the blockade phases only concern factions at war, not the peaceful ones. So, if this cannot find a valid trace route through friendly or neutral areas, so in this case, neutral nations can serve as transporters of our resources, then we place this marker here, which means blockade. This population and this resource is blockaded. And you've got fall as a season to fix it, or possibly winter if we're talking Russian resources. And then during the New Year's production, if the blockade remains in place, it has been applied after summer and it remains so after fall and until the New Year, then you lose, you don't exactly lose, but you don't count these population and resource values for your production. So, for example, if the German player cannot trace all of his resources and population towards Berlin, then we have to count the total of unblocked resources or unblocked population, and we again have to consult the lowest of all these to determine his production. So we count only the unblocked ones, the ones that during the blockade phase have managed to trace a trade route towards the main capital. So for purposes of blockade, once again, we can transport them through friendly areas, land areas, or open seas, or during neutral land areas, but not during rival or enemy land areas. So, for example, you can trace it through Iran because it is neutral to you. You have some trade deals and resources flowed through here, but you cannot trace it through Soviet Union, whether you are rivals or enemies.
Can you trace it through unpassable terrain like Tibet or Saudi Arabia?
No, you cannot. Thanks for the clarification. And also, one more, or rather two more restrictions are the following. You remember these escaped guys during a sea battle? They serve no other purpose than to blockade you, which means if a naval battle ended and in this area this guy he survives and this one is escaped, then this one does not affect control of the area. Units can freely pass here, units of the Western player. This area is not controlled by any means by the Axis player, but this one blocks the trade routes, so it is useful for blockading the Western player. So in this case, if both of these areas are either occupied by the Axis player or contain an escaped submarine, this is fully blockaded by sea. And one last restriction is that the trade route for blockade purposes has to include one sea segment and one land segment until reaching the Great Power's capital at max. So you can only use one land segment through land areas, neutral nations, and after using all these land areas, which may also include straits, they are both considered the land and sea areas for this purpose, then you have to possibly follow a sea route, and this route can only pass through sea areas, open seas of course, and friendly or rival or neutral straits again, and until reaching your capital. So in this case we could possibly have a land route towards here, and then if it is an open sea, we can use a sea segment in order to reach London through here and secure our resources. I barely have to mention that this only regards resources blockaded in summer, and that remains so after the fall. So it does not regard resources blockaded during fall, because there is no blockade after fall. even if he blocks this trade route. If this did not happen after summer and during the blockade phase, then if he does so during fall, you don't lose these resources and population values.
And what is that?
Yeah, of course. This one, which I have to mention, means that some resources may be transported through South Atlantic Ocean. So imagine, for example, that the German player is controlling these land areas, and so you cannot transport your resources through land. And for the purpose of this example, this sea area is also controlled. So your only way forward is this one, because, for example, this sea is also occupied, and so your trade route stops here. You cannot pass through Eastern Mediterranean. So you cannot pass through here, and you cannot pass through here. So the only way to transport your resources and population is around South Africa. When transporting resources around Africa, the meaning of this is that you lose half resources during the process for fuels and fares and everything like that. So among these two resources, if you transport them around Africa, you will only get one resource back to London. These red ones are the so-called trans-African resources, and these ones are lost. So we place this marker here and not this one. These are both med blockaded because the Axis player has blockaded the Mediterranean Sea, but you can normally transport them around Africa. So you lose only one of it and not both of it for the fare and fuel costs, let's put it like this.
Can units move that way too, or only resources?
Yes, it is otherwise a legal movement route, and this might come really handy if you want to redeploy your ships of Indian Ocean into the Atlantic or vice versa. And also it would be particularly creative and thoughtful by the Axis player, for example, to place a submarine here in South Atlantic Ocean in order to fully blockade your path around South Africa and thus fully blockade your resources and population. So at this point I would like to elaborate a bit more on the differences between supply and blockade so that you understand this better. And first of all, supply regards our units who cannot get their hands onto supply and thus die of attrition. And blockade regards our resources and population to determine whether this will be usable during the next year's production phase or not. Also, supply happens at the end of every season, while blockade only happens at the end of summer, thus after the player's movement, combat and supply phase. The second difference is that during blockade, the trade routes of resources and the population can traverse through neutral land, for example through Persia, while for purposes of supply, the unit cannot trace its supply chain during neutral land. One more difference is that the trade route, in order to check for blockade, has to consist of one land segment and one sea segment at max, while the supply chain can go from land to sea and from sea to land an indefinite amount of times. One more subtle but really important difference is that subs, after escaping a combat, block the trade routes for purposes of blockade, while they have no effect in supply. And the last one difference is that for purposes of supply, any faction's capital or sub-capital may work as a supply source. But for blockade, all these population and resources have to trace a route to their main capital, which in this case is London. And since we mentioned London, I have to clarify that if an enemy is controlling London at the start of a new year, you have no production at all. And with that, we conclude the rules section, and it's time to have some fun by actually playing this game. But of course, not before we talk a bit about strategy, which will be our next section. Enjoy and see you.